Before we jump into choosing the right verbs, you might first need a recap on what a verb is. If not, pick out the chapters below and skip to the part of the video you need. In front of you here, you've got different sorts of verbs. They are not just doing words. So I am, she is, he was, they will, we were are verbs. They are the verb to be conjugated in different forms. It's easy to forget that because we don't say we be, I be, he be, they bill, we beed. So it's easy not to recognise it's the verb to be. Now that's important because a verb will also be a state, and the verb to be is probably the most common verb you ever come across. So let's now test your knowledge of verbs. As I read the sentences out, think of what the verb is or pause the screen and get ahead. The elephant exploded with hysterical laughter. Exploded is the action, it's therefore the verb. The troop of gorillas beat their chests violently at the wicked hunters. The action here is not violently, it's beat. Beat is therefore the verb. The teacher was delightfully surprised by the student's behaviour. Now we have two potential actions here, surprised and behaviour. But behaviour here is a thing. The students aren't being described as doing the behaviour. Therefore, surprised is the action, behaviour is just a noun. If it had been surprised by the way the students were behaving, then behaving would also have been a verb. So if you need some practice at finding verbs, go through this paragraph and pick out the 8 verbs inside. Otherwise, check out the answers now. Good description tries to include as many verbs as possible. Verbs are much more important than adjectives and adverbs. Let's check them out. I clattered through the door, skidded through the hall and slid into the kitchen. You can feel the action brimming in that sentence. Here, my curry sizzled in the wok and I dolloped it on a plate. I gulped it down before crashing in front of the television to wallow in my favourite TV show. Hopefully you can see how that's built up a really vivid picture, and it's done through the verbs. That's why verbs are so important. All of the examples in this video have come from my ultimate guide to descriptive writing. Links in the description below. Good description tries to include as many verbs as possible. Verbs are much more important than adjectives and adverbs. Let's check them out. I clattered through the door, skidded through the hall and slid into the kitchen. You can feel the action brimming in that sentence. Here, my curry sizzled in the wok and I dolloped it on a plate. I gulped it down before crashing in front of the television to wallow in my favourite TV show. Hopefully you can see how that's built up a really vivid picture, and it's done through the verbs. That's why verbs are so important. Notice how these verbs recreate sounds. Good writers don't slow their writing down by telling us what sounds could be heard. Much of this work is instead done through the choice of verb, and you can see that clattered, skidded, sizzled, gulped and crashing all suggest a variety of sounds to go with the actions. This builds layers into your descriptions. It makes a soundscape. It creates a kind of 3D description without interrupting it to tell the reader in a clunky way what the sounds were. The second massive advantage of these verbs is that they tell us a lot about the character. We can work out what sort of person they are because they clatter through the door. They're obviously in a hurry, but insensitive to other people. They skidded in, and therefore they're probably not very organised or thinking about the consequences of their actions. They're incredibly hungry because they dollop the food on the plate, which means also not just that it was a huge amount, but they want to eat it quickly. And that's backed up by the idea of gulped. Again, we get a sense of how inconsiderate they are of other people with the verb crashing, and then we are invited by the writer to criticize them because instead of sitting in front of the television, they wallow in front of the television. It creates a picture of a character who's enjoying their greed far too much. And that was all done through a short bit of writing concentrating on the verbs. Now we have 2 paragraphs for you to practice with. Once you've spotted the verbs, decides which ones you'd keep and which ones you'd change to make it more powerful. The answers coming up right now. Okay, here are the verbs. Let's see what we might have changed them to. The surfer moved. That is a very neutral verb. We could have had glided or floated, which would create a much different feeling. She looked behind her. Again, that doesn't convey any emotion, whereas if we had glanced, we might get excitement or nervousness. Trying to time the next big wave, I don't think we could improve on because it tells us exactly what she's trying to do. There isn't a better way of saying that. Now she paddled hard, pushing with her palms. Well, obviously I'm going to keep those 2 verbs because they are precise, but also they have the alliteration of P, which creates that sense of urgency and rhythm. Notice it's also in a pattern of 3. Now, listing your verbs in this way is really powerful. Now, she's ready to surf the wave. Well, we kind of already know that because she is a surfer, so we could change that word to dominate or catch or survive, verbs which have a better emotion to them. Just in time, she straightened her arms. Now that again is a precise verb, so we're going to keep it. We might have something like stiffened, which would give the same idea and also add a sense of tension because something that's stiff might break. Here we're not suggesting that her arms would break, but that she would fail in her attempt to ride the wave. Sat up again is very neutral, it's precise, but we might have sprang up if we wanted a sense of urgency, or eased up if we wanted patience and calm. Again, if we wanted some emotion, instead of got to her feet, which is neutral, we might have sprang to her feet or stumbled to her feet. 2 contrasting ways of describing the character. Did you spot the state? The board was steady. There's the verb to be. Prepared for the coming rush does give us an emotional state, but we might have changed it to something like prayed for the coming rush or dreaded the coming rush. As the wave got bigger is very neutral. We want to give it some emotion, so we could have doubled or accelerated, verbs that would give us a sense of danger. She rode on its crest works well, but if we had the word balanced, we'd have an idea that she could fall at any time, whereas rode gives us the idea that she's safe and in control. To stay on the surface is, again, a neutral term, but if we'd had something like perched, then we might see that she could come off at any time again, whether voluntarily, like a bird that perches, or involuntarily because she doesn't have the balance. She bent her knees exactly describes the action, but again it's neutral, whereas if we said she steadied her knees, we'd get the sense that she's fighting for control, and a better way of doing that would be to say she braced her knees. That would imply she had to use a lot of force and was really scared of losing control of the board. To cope is emotional here. We know that there's an opportunity for the board to get away from her, but this implies her success. Whereas if we used a verb like to struggle with the force of the wave, we'd get the idea of possible failure as well. So you are now in a position to write fantastically good descriptions by controlling your choice of verbs. All of the examples in this video have come from my ultimate guide to descriptive writing. Links in the didgeridoo underneath. This is going to be a really quick lesson in how to create much more powerful description through controlling powerful verbs. I'm going to take you through this paragraph. It's a nice short one. There are 17 verbs in it. If you're not sure about your understanding of verbs, you should freeze the screen and try and find the verbs now, because I'm going straight to the answers. Pause or join me. Right, here are our 17 verbs. Now it's worth remembering that the more verbs you have in a piece of writing, the better the description. Verbs have a much more powerful effect than adjectives or adverbs, the things that teachers normally train you to put in your descriptive sentences. So instead of the dog ran on, I now have the dog leapt ahead. This is much faster and more out of control from the point of view of the dog owner. I've kept she cycled behind him because it is a precise verb that helps us picture exactly what's going on. But now I have the owner yelling for the dog to come back, whereas before I only had the idea of calling. Calling doesn't give us the sense of panic that yelling does. She was calling for the dog to come back, which I've kept the same because it tells us precisely what's going on. Fenton ignored her, sprinting further away. Let's see why those have changed. Fenton kept on going doesn't give us the emotion of the dog, whereas knowing that he'd ignored her tells us a lot about their relationship. Getting further away is very neutral, but sprinting further away shows that the dog is getting a much bigger advantage and she is losing much more control. Now she pumped the pedals as hard as she could. Obviously we love the alliteration, but pumped shows us her sense of urgency and panic and also her determination to try and catch her dog. Whereas pedalled as fast as she could doesn't have the alliteration and doesn't give us the idea that she might catch the dog in quite the same way as pumped does. His excited barks alarmed her as he tormented other dogs. So now her pet is dangerous, whereas before she could hear his excited barks, which therefore weren't threatening to anybody. And if those barks were just calling out to other dogs, then again there isn't a sense of threat. There isn't an emotion. So we change the verb to tormented. Next, she tracked him to where flocks of birds burst from the long grass. We love burst because it conveys the speed at which the birds are desperate to get away from the dog, and the alliteration emphasises that. Whereas before, the verb rising just told us exactly what they were doing, but not the emotional state of those birds and their desperation to escape being chewed. She could tell is accurate but very neutral. Whereas she tracked him suggests that she does have a level of competence, that she's going to be able to get hold of her dog again despite his speed and ill discipline. She reprimanded herself for not tying him on a lead when they set off. Reprimanded is quite a strong verb for telling off, and it's useful here because it shows that she's taking responsibility for her dog's behaviour. She knows that he's a naughty dog, and therefore she should have foreseen the ways in which he was going to be naughty. In this version, she wondered why she hadn't put him on a lead. Also makes her blame herself, but in a much more gentle way. We get the idea that she's a kind of dumb dog owner. Whereas in this version, she does have the skills. Remember, she tracked him. And she's telling herself off because she's taking responsibility. So I prefer the emotional content of this one. Now she should have been tying him on a lead, whereas before she was just thinking of putting him on a lead. Tying is a better response to the disobedience and the speed and power of her dog Fenton. And so it is a better verb to convey emotion. All the examples in this video have come from my ultimate guide to description. Links in the description below. And if you want to take your writing to the next level, you'll need to watch my next video on the superpower of adjectives. I hope I see you over there.